politics of the Irish Constitution and the pursuit of Irish unity from the period immediately before the inception of Bunreacht and Eireann up until the present day. So I recorded myself doing this a couple of times yesterday, and it was a slight bit over 10 minutes, but I'm going to try and keep it as tight as I can. So the first slide I have is about the lead up to Bunreacht and Eireann. So in the early 30s, Irish society is quite divided as the wounds of the Civil War are still very much open. So the 1922 Free State Constitution is what follows after the treaty. There's no referendum needed to amend it. So by 1931, it has been subject to 17 amendments. So therefore, the state is lacking a stable constitutional order before Bunreacht and Eireann comes into force. So how does Bunreacht and Eireann emerge then? Well, Fianna Fáil, they win the 1932 and 33 general elections, and this paves the way for the leader of Fianna Fáil, Eamon de Valera, to set out his own constitutional vision. So what Bunreacht and Eireann seeks to do then is to generate an ambience where citizens can find common ground irrespective of their different political affiliations. And therefore, the Constitution of 1937 reflects the values of society falling back on its own cultural resources in an era of crisis, as Kazan points out. So how exactly did the Constitution do this? Well, first of all, it emphasised Catholicism. So in Article 41, divorce became constitutionally prohibited. So this wasn't overly controversial at the time, but would later come to be important. And the other really significant way in which Catholicism is emphasised is in Article 44, which affirms the Catholic Church with a special position as the guardian of the faith professed by the great majority of citizens. So it's clear to see how there is favouritism here towards this recourse towards Catholicism, and it's interpreted as an attempt to equate Irishness with a Catholic identity. So also then the document, places particular emphasis on both territorial and cultural nationalism. So in Article 2, it set out how they claim that the national territory consists of the whole island of Ireland, its islands and its territorial seas. And despite acknowledging that partition has occurred in Article 3, the same article does refer to the right of the state to exercise jurisdiction over the whole national territory. So together, Articles 2 and 3 then lay this legal claim to the territory of Northern Ireland. And also cultural nationalism then in Article 8, what happens is that the Irish language is prioritised. So Gaeilge is recognised as the first official language, whereas English is relegated to the status of the second official language. And this contrasts from the 1922 Constitution, which put the two languages on an equal footing. So you can clearly see how this embodies the cultural nationalism of the document. So how was this received then? Well, south of the border, this was broadly acceptable. It was considered this portrait that was painted of Irish nationality was considered to reflect the dominant political culture in the 26 counties at the time. And by and large, it did cultivate this consensus, and 56.5% of people voted to adopt the constitution in a plebiscite, and it helped to cap the end of the revolutionary period and allowed the state to peaceably mature over the coming decades. Among Northern Unionists, however, it was viewed with disdain. So the emphasis that was placed on Catholicism meant that Irishness became associated with a Southern Catholic theocracy. And when this was combined with the unambivalent territorial and cultural nationalism, as Conor Cruise O'Brien put it, in terms of trying to attract Unionists to the idea of Irish unity, Bunreacht and Eireann was somewhat of an odd bouquet to choose. So interesting language there, but clearly you can see the idea that O'Brien is trying to get across, or Cruise O'Brien is trying to get across. So how does this odd bouquet create a paradox of sorts? Well, there's an applied assumption in my research, which is that at every point in time since 1937, the Irish government would have acknowledged that some level of unionist engagement would have increased the likelihood of Irish unity occurring. So this is open to critique. But if you look at two things, if you look at the historical demographics in the North, and if you look at the post-Good Friday Agreement political culture, which aspires towards creating consensus, these both suggest that my assumption was fair. So this odd bouquet, this blending of Catholicism with cultural and territorial nationalism, it leads to a paradox. Because on one hand, unity is aspired towards in Articles 2 and 3, and on the other hand, the blending of this Catholicism with both the cultural and territorial nationalism wasn't actually likely to attract Unionists to the idea of Irish unity. So this was pointed out then by Frank McDermott, TD. So he's a TD at the time when the Constitution is being debated in the Dáil, and he highlights the paradox of the document's recommend. And he argues that to achieve unity, we've got to offer Northern Protestants an Ireland in which a place can be found for their traditions as well as ours. And until we are willing to do this, we are partitionists at heart, no matter how loudly we shout about unity. So he believed that the wording in Article 44 around the special position of the Church served no purpose except to create misunderstandings. And he argues that Article 8 and the prioritisation of the Irish language within it represented an artificial and mischievous Gaelicization that served only to create unnecessary barriers between ourselves and Northern Unionists. So you can see the point he's trying to make. However, his analysis has been compared to a lone voice crying in the wilderness, and essentially his arguments fall on deaf ears, and the Constitution, as we mentioned already, was ratified by the plebiscite. So developments in the 40s and 50s then in subsequent years highlight this tension of ambitions within the constitution. So the Republic of Ireland Act in 1948, this is where Ireland declares itself a republic and leaves the Commonwealth. So, however, when viewed purely through the lens of the Northern Question, this Republic of Ireland Act removes the short to medium term possibility that partition could be resolved through membership of the Commonwealth. So we can see how the Northern Question was in conflict with this aim of the nationalist movement, which was to declare Ireland a republic, and essentially the Northern Question isn't prioritised. And then in the 50s, unionists perceived that the constitution fuels the IRA border campaign of the late 50s and early 60s. So what happens is that this paradox plays out in practice. Unity is aspired towards, but in practice, actual events don't appear to further the ambition. So it takes until the 1960s before some within the Irish political establishment begin to accept that the constitutional changes would be likely to be required in order to further the constitution's own anti-partition aims. So I'm going to try and keep this as tight as I can. I know there's a lot of information on this slide. Basically, there's a number of Oireachtas committees, the first of which is in the 1960s, the Committee on the Constitution, and this recommends a series of changes to what we previously termed the Odd Bouquet. So it recommends amending changes to Article 3, removing the special position of the Catholic Church, and removing the constitutional ban on divorce, which at this stage had become sort of entangled with the national question because divorce wasn't prohibited by all of the Protestant churches in all circumstances. So these recommendations, their impact was considered to be too much too soon, and they were considered to be quite radical. Only one of the recommendations was put to referendum, and this was the one on the special position of the church in 1972. And indeed, this actually was removed in 1972. However, this is against the backdrop of the Catholic Church not opposing its removal, and also it was a little bit too little too late. The Troubles had, certainly got underway, and the context for reform had changed. So then in the 1970s, there was two other committees. There was the Inter-Party Committee on the Implications of Irish Unity and the 1974 Committee on Irish Relations. These both came to grief over Articles 2 and 3 and neither instigated any real constitutional amendments or any reform of any major sort. And then in the 80s, we have the New Ireland Forum and the Anglo-Irish Agreement. So both were considered to be fairly positive developments, but once again, neither instituted any real progress in terms of constitutional amendments. So once again, then in the 1986, we can see how this divorce referendum, so the first divorce referendum, this was comfortably defeated. And to many unionists, this was a sign that there was evidence to say that the Catholic Church continued to have an overt influence in the affairs of the southern state. So basically, there's very little meaningful progress possible before the 1990s. So then between 1995 and 2015, the constitution underwent changes so that by the time 2015 rolls around, the tone of the document had changed quite dramatically. So on the religious front, as we mentioned, Article 44.1 on the special position of the church, this had been removed in 1972. In 1995, the divorce referendum passes, so divorce is no longer prohibited in all circumstances. And in 2015, then we have the same-sex marriage referendum. So the southern state can no longer be cast aside as a Catholic theocracy in the minds of northern unionists. And on the nationalist front, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 removes a territorial claim and it's replaced with new provisions. So the language is toned down in the new Article 3. So unity is said to be the firm will of the Irish nation, but emphasis shifts towards the language of uniting people rather than uniting territory. And then Article 8, the other aspect, this remains, but it's considered to be less contentious than the old territorial claims in Articles 2 and 3. So then by 2015, we can say that the odd bouquet of constitutional ambitions was now effectively consigned to history. But this didn't necessarily mean that unity was any closer. So in the South, questioning the Good Friday Agreement was discouraged for fear of antagonising loyalists. And in the North, the border had been removed from the day-to-day politics, and although the national question wasn't necessarily considered to be resolved, unity had become somewhat of a dormant matter. And this is reflected in the RTE opinion poll in 2015, which shows that only 36% of people in the South and only 27% of Northern Catholics favoured Irish unity in the short to medium term. But of course, in 2016, all would change, and this is because of Brexit. So in the North, Brexit reinforces the traditional tribal divide over constitutional issues. So overall, 56% vote to remain. And when we look at the Remain side of the vote, the majority of nationalists vote to remain, and the majority of people who identify as neither unionist or nationalist vote to remain, 71% of these cohort of people. On the Leave side, the DUP are the only major party to campaign in favour of Brexit, and a majority of unionists vote to leave the EU. So consequently, identity questions re-emerge to come back into sharp focus, and the border issue is reintroduced to the day-to-day politics. So as we can see then, Brexit changes things, and it does change opinions on partition. So in the North, we have this 2019 opinion poll conducted by Lord Ashcroft, which suggests that 51% of respondents did favour Irish unity when don't know answers were discarded. And in the South, this is also replicated, that this surge in support for unity can be seen in a different 2019 poll, which showed that 65% of people would vote for Irish unity if a referendum was held the following day. And only as recently as this month, actually, Fairburn Live Show, they conducted a poll which showed that 53% of people in the South would support Irish unity. So what this does then is it draws attention to Bunreacht and Eireann, and the question is raised about whether the constitution would be conducive to Irish unity. So from an institutional perspective, it would seem that the constitution might accommodate the transition to a united Ireland. First and foremost, this is because provision is made for the possible retention of the Stormont Assembly in a united Ireland. So, as you say in Article 15.2 here, provision is made for the creation or recognition of subordinate legislatures. So this was drafted by De Valera with unification in mind, and of course it still bears relevance today. Secondly, suggestions are that the Seanad could be reformed as a way of ensuring a minimum level of representation of unionist interests. So clearly some creative thinking would be required to work out the mechanics of this, but it's likely to be at least considered. Thirdly, then, Article 16.2 would appear to represent or almost guarantee a minimum level of unionist representation in the Dáil. And this is because Article 16.2 requires 1 TD for every 30,000 people, and it requires a minimum number of 3 TDs be elected per constituency. So because unionist parties consistently attract high levels of support in certain parts of the North, 16.2 would essentially guarantee them a minimum level of unionist representation. And lastly, then, Article 29, this affirms Ireland's commitment to the EU project. And we know from the analysis of the Brexit vote that a majority of Ulster Unionist Party voters did opt to remain in the EU. So potentially, then, some unionists might be attracted to the idea of the benefits of EU membership within a united Ireland. So what about the other side of things? So where might the constitution possibly restrain a meeting of minds? Identity questions. So first and foremost is the question of the national flag. This is enshrined in Article 7. So the tricolour to unionists, it's been, many unionists refuse to accept the validity of the tricolour as an appropriate symbol. And of course, flags are regularly a flashpoint for conflict in the North. However, the tricolour is cherished by nationalists. So we see this Journal.ie poll from 2018, which shows that only 35% of respondents would be in favour of changing the flag in the event of Irish unity. And what about the superior status of Irish language in Article 8? So there had been suggestions that parity of esteem be incorporated into the Constitution and the two languages be put on equal footing. But equally, some have argued that this might perpetuate inequalities that native Irish speakers suffer even further, and it might dilute their rights even further. So we can see how conflict might ensue here. The national anthem is another issue. So this actually isn't enshrined in the Constitution, but it's likely to be part of this overall conversation on identity. And there are questions about whether Eireann Levine will be appropriate given their shared history. Senator Mark Daly, he's conducted a bit of research into this, and he suggests that he conducted a study which showed that 84% of people supported Eireann Levine, and he believes on this basis that no change will be required in order to facilitate unification. And lastly, then, the relationship between unionists and the United Kingdom in a post-unity environment. Does this relationship take on an official capacity, and if so, how? Well, Article 29 would appear to enable Ireland to rejoin the Commonwealth if desired. However, this is likely to prove controversial, as many people have come to value the Republican character of the state. And I can hear a few chuckles in the background there, but I might give you an idea. But but it's clear to see how all of these issues, you have to be teased out a bit. And as this next slide shows, the question is asked: then, are there still limits to Southern nationalism's willingness to engage? So, as the previous slide highlights, each and every proposal on identity will probably be disagreeable to somebody. And this is brought into even sharper focus by the analysis of the late Gareth Fitzgerald. So he argues that despite the persistence of the aspiration of Irish unity, the fundamental loyalty of most people in this part of Ireland is to our own state rather than to a notional or abstract united Ireland. So this may or may not be true. I'm not really capable of saying, but if we assume that it was true, then surely then there's a possibility that some in the 26 counties might be completely reluctant to consider even minimal concessions in order to aid the transition to Irish unity. So the question is raised then, is there a potential for the danger for history to repeat? So we've seen in the past how Southern nationalism.
Time now, Matthew. Everyone will want to ask you a question here. Yeah, guarantee it. I'm just constantly Emer's up at 12, but do you want to jump to your?
This is my conclusion here. Essentially, it feeds into it. So we've seen in the past how the Southern nationalists their willingness to be open-minded has at times been restrained by loyalty towards an existing conception of identity. So we've seen how Frank McDermott's argument has been largely ignored for many years. We've seen how the Republic of Ireland Act, Southern nationalism prioritised the declaration of the Republic over potentially using the Commonwealth membership to prioritise unity. And we've seen how the pace of constitutional change was slow before 1995. So if Fitzgerald's analysis is true, then there would appear to be a danger of history repeating. So in conclusion then, only time will tell if history will repeat in this way, but it is possible to see how a significant obstacle to achieving Irish unity in contemporary times might possibly be an unwillingness to approach with an open mind the complex questions regarding national identity in a united Irish state. So as unity is the firm will of the Irish nation under Article 3, the responsibility to manage this process falls to the government, and this raises the point made by High Court Judge Richard Humphreys, where he says a massive loss of nerve by the political leadership of the 26 counties is probably the greatest threat to the achievement of Irish unity.